The sound of approaching hooves tore through the silence of the barren Montana prairie, kicking up dust that mingled with the evening's fading light. Sophia Harrison clutched her tattered dress against her chest, struggling to remain upright as the world around her blurred. 3 days without food, 5 with barely any water, and the promise of a husband waiting at the end of her journey seemed like a cruel joke now. The rider slowed his horse, squinting into the distance at her frail figure swaying in the merciless heat of the summer of 1874. Frank Sullivan had not expected to find anyone on his way back to his homestead, certainly not a woman who looked as if she might crumble to dust with the next gust of wind. "Madam." His voice carried across the distance between them, deep and uncertain. "You all right there?" Sophia tried to respond, but her parched throat betrayed her, and she felt her knees finally give way beneath her. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the thunder of hooves rushing toward her and strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. When consciousness returned, Sophia found herself propped against a saddle, the rough leather oddly comforting against her back. A canteen pressed against her lips, and she drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and neck. "Easy now," the man cautioned, his weathered face coming into focus. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Sophia nodded weakly, taking smaller sips as she studied her rescuer. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His face was tanned from countless hours under the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was in his early 30s. A well-worn hat shadowed piercing blue eyes that regarded her with concern rather than judgment. "I'm Frank Sullivan," he said, tearing a piece of bread from a small loaf and offering it to her. "Own a cattle ranch about 5 miles east of here." "Sophia Harrison," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper as she accepted the bread with trembling fingers. I was supposed to meet my betrothed in Timberline." Frank's expression darkened. "Timberline's another 20 miles west, madam, and nobody's waiting for you there." He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Town burned down 3 weeks ago. Most folks moved on to Rivercross or further west." The news hit Sophia like a physical blow. She had spent every penny she had on the train ticket from Boston to Helena, then used what little remained to secure passage with a wagon train that had abandoned her when she fell ill with fever. Her intended husband, a man named Edward Wheeler, whom she knew only through correspondence, was supposed to be waiting in Timberline. "You're welcome to rest at my place until you figure things out," Frank offered, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "Can't leave you out here, and there's not much else between here and nowhere." Too exhausted and defeated to argue, Sophia nodded her acceptance. Frank helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her and keeping one arm securely around her waist as they rode east, the setting sun at their backs casting long shadows ahead. Frank's place turned out to be a modest but well-built cabin with a small barn and corral nearby. A few cattle grazed in the distance, and a vegetable garden flourished beside the house. It wasn't grand, but it spoke of hard work and care, something Sophia could respect. "It ain't much," Frank said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it's shelter and it's mine." There was a hint of pride in his voice that Sophia found oddly reassuring. The interior was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center, and a curtained-off area presumably led to a sleeping area. Frank guided her to one of the chairs and set about preparing a proper meal. "Been out checking the herd," he explained as he sliced bread and added it to a pot of stew that had been simmering on the stove. "Good thing I decided to come back early. Might not have found you otherwise." Sophia watched him move about the cabin, struck by the efficiency of his movements and the lack of wasted motion. Everything about Frank Sullivan suggested a man of few words but decisive action. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Frank glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Eat first. Rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." That night, Sophia slept in Frank's bed while he took a bedroll by the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully as her mind raced with the implications of her situation. No husband to be waiting. No money to return east. No prospects in this harsh, unfamiliar land. By morning, however, one thing had become clear. She would not allow herself to be a burden on this man who had already shown her more kindness than most. She rose early, determined to make herself useful, and was frying bacon when Frank emerged from his makeshift bed, surprise evident on his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. "I need to earn my keep," Sophia replied firmly. "I won't be a charity case, Mr. Sullivan." A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Frank," he corrected, "and I reckon I won't argue with a hot breakfast." Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Frank tended to his cattle and the daily work of the ranch, while Sophia took over the cooking and cleaning of the cabin. She discovered a half-finished quilt in a chest and spent her evenings working on it, finding solace in the rhythmic motion of needle through fabric. Frank, for his part, seemed content with their arrangement. He was a man of few words, but Sophia gradually learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight furrow of his brow when he was concerned, the barely perceptible softening of his eyes when he was pleased, the tightening of his jaw when something troubled him. On the fourth evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Frank finally asked the question that had likely been on his mind since finding her. "What made you decide to come out here as a mail-order bride?" Sophia's fingers stilled on the quilt. "My father died last winter," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Left nothing but debts. My mother had passed years before. I was working as a seamstress, but it wasn't enough to keep a roof over my head." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I saw an advertisement seeking women of good character for marriage to frontier men. It seemed like a solution. And this Edward Wheeler, you knew him well, only through letters, 6 of them over 3 months." She gave a small, rueful smile. "He wrote that he had a prosperous business in timberline and was seeking a refined lady to share his life. He sent money for my passage." Frank nodded slowly. "Some men paint pretty pictures with words. Reality's often different, like a town that no longer exists." Sophia's attempt at humor fell flat and she sighed. "I should have been more cautious, I suppose, but options for women alone are limited." "What will you do now?" Frank asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sophia had been considering this very question. "I need to find work." "Perhaps in Rivercross. You mentioned it was the nearest town. It's a rough place, not much call for seamstresses. I can cook, clean, I'm not afraid of hard work." Frank stared into the fire for a long moment. "Winter's coming in a few months makes travel difficult." He cleared his throat. "You're welcome to stay here until spring if you'd like. I could use the help around the place." The offer hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Sophia studied his face, searching for hidden motives, but found only sincerity and perhaps a hint of hope. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "It's practical," he countered. "Place runs better with 2 pairs of hands." Sophia nodded slowly. "Until spring, then, but I insist on earning my keep. Wouldn't have it any other way." As summer faded into autumn, Sophia found herself settling into life at the Sullivan Ranch. Frank taught her to ride, starting with an elderly mare named Daisy, whose placid temperament suited a beginner. He showed her how to milk the 2 cows he kept for dairy, how to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, and how to identify which vegetables in the garden were ready for harvest. In return, Sophia brought order and comfort to the cabin. She mended Frank's clothes, baked bread that filled the house with its warm, yeasty aroma, and added feminine touches that transformed the utilitarian space into something approaching a home. They spoke little of their pasts, both seeming to prefer focusing on the present, but gradually pieces of their histories emerged. Sophia learned that Frank had come west at 18, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to claim his own land 5 years ago. His parents were still back east in Pennsylvania, and he had a younger sister who wrote occasionally. Frank discovered that Sophia had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a bookkeeper whose fortunes had declined after an illness left him unable to work. She had been educated at a girls' school until 16, when finances forced her to leave and begin apprenticing with a dressmaker. "Never thought I'd end up here," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. "When I was a girl, I dreamed of living in a fine house in the city, hosting dinner parties and wearing beautiful gowns." Frank chuckled softly. "And I dreamed of being a ship captain sailing to distant lands." Sophia turned to him, surprised. "Really, I wouldn't have guessed that." "My grandfather was a sailor, used to tell me stories," he shrugged. "Never even seen the ocean, though." "It's beautiful," Sophia said wistfully. "Terrifying and beautiful all at once. Like most worthwhile things, I reckon." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them before both looked away, suddenly self-conscious. The first frost came earlier than expected, coating the grass with silver and bringing a sharp bite to the morning air. Frank spent long days preparing for winter chopping and stacking firewood, smoking meat, repairing gaps in the barn's walls. Sophia worked alongside him, her initial helplessness giving way to a quiet competence that earned his respect. One evening, as they sat at the table enjoying a stew made from the last of the garden vegetables, a knock at the door startled them both. Visitors were rare, especially with winter approaching. Frank opened the door to reveal a man in his 40s, well-dressed despite the dust of travel. "Sullivan," the man nodded. "Been a while." "Harrington," Frank acknowledged, stepping aside to let him enter. "What brings you out this way?" The newcomer's eyes immediately went to Sophia, curiosity evident in his expression. "Business in Rivercross. Thought I'd stop by on my way back to Helena." He removed his hat. "James Harrington, madam. Pleased to make your acquaintance." "Sophia Harrison," she replied with a polite nod. Frank's posture had subtly stiffened. "Harrington owns the bank in Helena, also has interests in mining operations throughout the territory. And always looking for new opportunities," Harrington added smoothly, accepting the coffee Sophia offered. "Which brings me to the purpose of my visit, Sullivan. I'd like to renew my offer for your land." Frank's jaw tightened. "Land's not for sale. The railroad's coming through, you know." "Not directly through your property, but close enough. I'm prepared to offer 3 times what I offered last year." "Not interested." Harrington sighed, turning his attention to Sophia. "Perhaps you can talk some sense into him, Mrs. Sullivan. This is a generous offer that would set you both up comfortably." "Miss Harrison is a guest," Frank said before Sophia could correct the assumption. "And my answer stands." The banker studied them both, his eyes calculating. "I see. Well, my offer remains open should you reconsider." He rose to leave, then paused. "By the way, there was some talk in Helena about a mail-order bride who never made it to her groom. Fellow named Wheeler was causing quite a stir, claiming she'd stolen his money and disappeared." Sophia paled. "That's not true. I spent every cent getting here, only to find timberline burned to the ground. Harrington raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Wheeler never mentioned that part, seemed more concerned about getting his investment back. Miss Harrison has done nothing wrong, Frank said firmly, his hand unconsciously moving to her shoulder in a protective gesture. Wheeler's claims are false. I'm sure they are, Harrington replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Still, might be awkward if she were to travel to Helena anytime soon. People do love their gossip. He settled his hat back on his head. Think about my offer, Sullivan. It's only going to get harder for small ranchers like you. After he'd gone, Sophia sank into a chair, trembling slightly. He didn't believe me. Doesn't matter what Harrington believes, Frank said, pouring her a small measure of whiskey. Drink this, it'll help with the shock. But if people in Helena think I'm a thief, you're not going to Helena, Frank stated flatly. And Wheeler can't prove anything because there's nothing to prove. Sophia took a small sip, grimacing at the burn. Why does he want your land so badly? Frank sat heavily in the chair across from her. Water rights, mainly. My property includes a reliable creek that feeds into the larger river. In this territory, water's worth more than gold sometimes. He ran a hand through his hair. Been fighting him off for 2 years now. He seemed to think you'd sell this time. Probably thought having a woman here would make me more likely to take the money. Frank's eyes met hers. Some men might see it that way. But not you. This land is more than just a financial investment to me. Sophia nodded, understanding. The ranch wasn't just property to Frank, it was his dream, his future, the physical manifestation of his hard work and determination. What will you do? Same thing I've been doing, stand my ground, he hesitated. But Harrington can make trouble when he wants to, and now he might use you to do it. I'm sorry, Sophia whispered. I've brought complications to your door. Frank shook his head firmly. You've nothing to apologize for. Harrington was a problem long before you arrived, and Wheeler sounds like a man who got caught in his own lies. His expression softened slightly. Besides, having you here has been good. The simple admission hung in the air between them, laden with meanings neither was ready to articulate. Winter descended in earnest the following week, bringing howling winds and snow that transformed the landscape into an endless expanse of white. The world contracted to the warm confines of the cabin and the necessary trips to the barn to tend the animals. Days blended into nights, marked by shared meals, quiet conversations by the fire, and the occasional reading aloud from one of Frank's small collection of books. Sophia found herself studying Frank when he wasn't looking the way his hands, rough from work yet gentle with animals, moved as he carved a piece of wood, the rare smile that transformed his serious face, the steady reliability of his presence. She caught him watching her too sometimes, his eyes quickly darting away when she noticed. They maintained careful boundaries, sleeping in separate spaces and keeping a respectful distance, but the forced proximity of winter made their growing awareness of each other increasingly difficult to ignore. One night, a particularly fierce blizzard descended, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every crack in the cabin's walls. Sophia added wood to the fire, but the temperature continued to drop. She could see her breath in the air as she huddled beneath her quilt. This isn't working, Frank said finally, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. You'll freeze over there. I'm fine, Sophia insisted through chattering teeth. Frank sighed, rising from his bedroll. Don't be stubborn, Sophia. It's practical sense, nothing more. Body heat's the best way to stay warm in weather like this. After a moment of hesitation, Sophia nodded. They arranged their bedding together near the fire, and Frank carefully positioned himself beside her, keeping a blanket between them as a token concession to propriety. Better. he asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet darkness. Yes, she admitted, feeling the warmth of his body gradually reaching her through the layers of fabric. Thank you. They lay in silence for a long time, both acutely aware of the other's breathing, the occasional shift of position, the strange intimacy of sharing space. "Frank," Sophia whispered, uncertain if he was still awake. Have you ever been married?" There was a long pause before he answered. "No, came close once back in Pennsylvania. Her father didn't approve of my plans to head west. She didn't fight for you. Some dreams aren't worth fighting for, I guess." His voice held no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance. "What about you? Before this Wheeler arrangement, was there someone?" Sophia thought of Thomas, the banker's son who had courted her briefly before her father's death. "There was a young man who showed interest, but he disappeared quickly enough when my circumstances changed. It seems neither of us inspired enough devotion." "His loss," Frank said simply, and Sophia felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with shared body heat. They fell asleep that way, back to back, connected yet separate, each lost in thoughts of what might have been and what might yet be. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the land, Sophia found herself dreading the conversation she knew they needed to have. She had promised to stay only until winter's end, and now that travel was possible again, she had no legitimate reason to remain. Frank seemed equally reluctant to broach the subject. He spent long days working with the cattle, returning to the cabin only when necessary, his usual quiet demeanor now tinged with an edge of withdrawal that hurt more than Sophia cared to admit. The decision was forced when a letter arrived from Rivercross. The town was growing with the anticipated railroad connection, and they were seeking a teacher for the newly established school. The position included room and board above the schoolhouse and a modest salary. "It's a good opportunity," Frank said when she showed him the letter, his face carefully blank. "You said you had some schooling." "I did," Sophia confirmed, "but I've never taught before. You're smart. You'd learn quick." He turned away, focusing intently on cleaning his rifle. "Rivercross is becoming more civilized, safer for a woman alone." "Yes, I suppose it is." Sophia felt a hollowness in her chest. "Is that what you think I should do?" Frank was silent for a long moment. "I think you should do what's best for your future. And what if I'm not sure what that is?" His hand stilled on the rifle. "A woman like you deserves more than a hard life on a struggling ranch, Sophia." "Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve?" Frank finally looked at her, conflict evident in his eyes. "What do you want, then?" The question hung between them, demanding an honesty Sophia wasn't sure either of them was ready for. "I want," she began, then faltered. "I've come to care for this place, and for the life I've found here." "The life or the person?" Frank asked, his voice barely audible. "Is there a difference?" He set the rifle aside and moved toward her with a deliberate slowness that gave her ample time to retreat if she wished. She held her ground, heart pounding as he stopped just inches away. "I'm not a man of fancy words," Frank said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Never had much use for them. But I need to be clear now so there's no misunderstanding." He took a deep breath. "I don't want you to go to Rivercross. I want you to stay here with me, not as a guest or a helper, but as my wife, if that's something you might want too." Sophia felt tears spring to her eyes. "When I came west, I thought I was being practical, making a sensible arrangement with a stranger for mutual benefit." Frank's face fell slightly, and he began to step back. "But then I found you," she continued quickly, reaching for his hand, "and discovered that what I really wanted, what I never dared hope for, was to find someone whose quiet strength would become my shelter, someone who would share his bread and his life with me, asking nothing in return." "Is that a yes?" Frank asked, the beginnings of a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes," Sophia whispered, "it's a yes." His kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, before deepening with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally pulled apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not a wealthy man," he warned. "This life won't be easy." "I didn't fall in love with your circumstances, Frank Sullivan. I fell in love with you." They were married 2 weeks later in River Cross, with the local preacher officiating and a handful of Frank's neighboring ranchers as witnesses. Sophia wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Frank had splurged on a new shirt and had his best trousers pressed for the occasion. The school board was disappointed to lose their potential teacher, but offered Sophia the opportunity to teach reading to adults 1 evening a week for a small stipend. She accepted gladly, seeing it as a chance to contribute to their income while still making their ranch her primary focus. Summer brought its own challenges. A dispute over water rights with a neighboring property required Frank to spend days riding the boundaries, ensuring his creek wasn't being diverted. Wolves threatened the cattle twice, requiring constant vigilance. And rumors persisted that Harrington was still interested in acquiring their land, possibly through less savory means than a direct offer. Through it all, Sophia remained a steady presence, working alongside Frank when needed, maintaining their home and gradually transforming their relationship from a partnership of convenience to a deep and abiding love. They learned each other's habits and quirks, developed private jokes and shared memories, and discovered the profound comfort of having someone who truly saw and accepted them. In late autumn, as they prepared for another winter, a wagon arrived at their ranch. The driver, a young man who introduced himself as the new sheriff of River Cross, brought unexpected news. James Harrington was arrested in Helena, he informed them. Fraud, mainly. Seems he was selling land he didn't own to multiple buyers. "Your name was on a list in his office, Mr. Sullivan, along with some rather disturbing notes about alternate acquisition methods." Frank's arm tightened around Sophia's waist. "Can't say I'm surprised. Man never did take no for an answer." "There's more," the sheriff continued. "That fellow Wheeler who was claiming a mail-order bride swindled him. Turns out he was working with Harrington. Never owned property in Timberline at all. They've been running this scheme across 3 territories, bringing women out west, then abandoning them or worse." Sophia felt a chill despite the warm sun. "There were others like me. At least 6 that they've identified so far. You're the only one who wasn't found by one of Harrington's men afterward." The sheriff gave Frank a respectful nod. "Seems you interrupted their plans, Mr. Sullivan." After the sheriff departed, promising to keep them informed of the proceedings against Harrington and Wheeler, Sophia and Frank stood on their porch, watching the wagon disappear down the trail. "I could have ended up like those other women," Sophia said quietly, "if you hadn't found me that day." Frank pulled her close. "But I did find you, and you found me right back." She smiled up at him. "I suppose sometimes things work out exactly as they should, even when they don't work out as planned." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sophia working on a small blanket while Frank whittled a wooden horse, she broached a subject that had been on her mind for some time. "I've been thinking about names," she said casually. "For the baby." Frank's hands froze mid-motion. "Baby." Sophia nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Due in early spring, according to my calculations." The whittling knife clattered to the floor as Frank moved to kneel before her, his hands gently covering hers on her still flat stomach. "You're certain?" "As certain as a woman can be." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but his words, spoken with reverent wonder, brought tears to her eyes. I found a half-starved woman in the prairie and shared my bread. She gave me a home in return and now a family. I reckon that's the best trade any man ever made." As the first snow of winter began to fall outside their window, Sophia leaned forward to kiss her husband, thinking of the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment, to this man, whose quiet strength had become the foundation of her world, and whose love had turned a simple cabin on the Montana frontier into the home she'd always dreamed of finding.